Uh,
So thank you everyone for joining me for the first webinar of this online course on operationalizing the right to development and implementing the sustainable development goals. It's an absolute pleasure to have you all joining me. Thank you on behalf of the University for Peace, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the United Nations Universities International Institute for Global Health. We are very delighted to have you all join us for this course. So without further ado, let me just share with you what the agenda for today's webinar is. Just one housekeeping rule, please permit me to complete my presentation and then we will have ample time for questions and answers. So please wait till the end for the floor to be open for Q&A. You are of course free in the meantime to type in your questions if you have in the chat box so that you keep them ready and it doesn't drift off from your chain of thoughts. In any case, once we open the Q&A session, you have the choice either of speaking and asking your question or typing into the chat box. And I'm very happy to answer all of them. So this is the agenda for today's presentation. I will begin with an overview of the right to development. And this obviously is very important to ensure that we are all on the same page, particularly with relation to the normative and the operational dimensions of the right to development. I will then move on to a very brief overview of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in order to then draw the symbiotic relationship between the right to development on the one hand and sustainable development on the other. Having done this, we will analyze a few key aspects of what does it really mean to operationalize the right to development in implementing the SDGs. Of course, the rest of the course from week 2 until week 4 goes into specific thematic dimensions of how right to development can be operationalized across various SDGs. So in this presentation, I will talk about some of the most important cross-cutting themes when we talk about operationalizing the right to development in implementing the SDGs. Finally, I will highlight the heightened importance of operationalizing the right to development during and in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic. And I particularly will try to situate this in the context of the fact that the 2030 agenda was already way off track. It was already derailed even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, we had decelerated on almost every single goal since 2015 up until 2019, year by year. So 2019 was worse than 2018 in terms of our progress on the goals and targets of the 2030 agenda. What the COVID-19 pandemic has done, it has only exacerbated the derailment of the agenda. And one of the things that we will constantly try to highlight throughout this course is that the very reason why the 2030 agenda was derailed even prior to the pandemic was that the right to development was not operationalized. If we have to bring back the 2030 agenda on course, therefore, after the pandemic is over, or even during the recovery, the only way to do so is to operationalize the right to development. And of course, then we will have ample time for questions and answers. So let's get cracking into what is the right to development and what are its key features. Now, I have always felt that the best way to understand the right to development is to take a step back into history. The right to development emerged in the context of decolonization that started taking place in full flow in the 1960s and the 70s, particularly in Africa and Asia. But what happened with decolonization was that the newly independent countries soon realized that they had been born into an international economic regime that they had no say in the creation of. The what we today call, even today, the most important institutions of global governance, and you can think of which they are: the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, of course, was established in 1994, but its predecessor was the GATT 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. All of these institutions were established at the end of World War II by the victors of the war. And obviously, what we today call as a developing world was not in existence at the time. It was simply part and parcel of someone else's power structure. And what I mean by that is that the developing countries of today, particularly in Africa and Asia, were still colonized at the time when the World War II ended and when these institutions of economic regime were established. So most of the decolonized countries were simply born into debt. How are they going to bring in money to live another day when they became independent? So they had no choice but to get loans from the International Monetary Fund and, of course, also World Bank for the development activities. And they were also born into an international trade regime created through the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was not for their interests at all. It wasn't meant to be for their interests because they were simply non-existent at the time that the agreements were created. So they were entirely disillusioned with this economic regime that they were born into. And so once they started gaining numerical strength, once more and more developing countries started becoming independent and becoming members of the United Nations system, they set into motion what was at that time in literature called as the reformist agenda. This agenda focused on reforming the economic institutions of the time, particularly the IMF, World Bank, and the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. However, this was rather unsuccessful, principally because even the rules for modifying or amending these institutional structures needed the consensus, or needed at least the consent of the countries that controlled these economic institutions, and they wouldn't be very willing to give away the powers that they benefited from a lopsided structure of global governance. And we see many of the manifestations of that even today in, let's say, debates around Security Council reforms or reforms of the World Bank even today, with, as we know, only one country, the United States, controls the almost as a de facto veto power at the IMF and World Bank, because for anything to be approved, you need 85% votes, and US alone controls about 16% votes. So you never reach 85 if US is not on board. You are always stuck at 84%. Right? So these kinds of difficulties were faced even more at the time, which meant that the reformist agenda could not be successful. The only success, partially in the larger scheme of things, but still a relatively important success, was the establishment of the UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, as an organ or as a body, a subsidiary body of the General Assembly of the United Nations. And UNCTAD has continued to do some remarkable work even today over the years, and it has remained as relevant as it could be under the political structures. But this was only the success story of the time. The major institutions could not be reformed. And this led really to a change of approach among the developing countries, the newly independent countries. And they were joined, of course, by countries from Latin America who had become independent way back, but still had not managed to benefit from the global economic regime decided upon by the victors of the war. And this led to what was then later on called as the restructuring agenda. The restructuring agenda did not focus as much on institutional amendments, but rather on changing the very fundamentals of the economic order itself. The principles governing the international economic regime itself needed to be modified. And this led in the mid 1970s in particular to a slew of activities through resolutions and declarations at the United Nations General Assembly. The most prominent of these was the 1974 Declaration on the establishment of a new international economic order. The name reveals a lot of things, right? It's a new international economic order, signifying that what existed at the time was not beneficial to the interests of the developing world. It only benefited the developed countries, the global north, as we metaphorically call it. And what is needed is establishment of a new international economic order. This in 1974 was a big deal. And it was the first time, really, that the developing countries who had gained numerical majority in the General Assembly by this time for resolutions by them to get passed started gaining power and had a mechanism where their views could be expressed. Of course, it was a disputed resolution, meaning that many of the developed countries did not vote in favor of this declaration. They opposed it. But some of the important paragraphs of this declaration reveal a lot about not just in terms of the historical value of this resolution, but I would also say in terms of the introspective value of the situation existing even in our today's world in 2021. So paragraph 1 began by the statement, the developing countries, which constitute 70% of the world's population, account for only 30% of the world's income. It has proved impossible to achieve an even and balanced development of the international community under the existing international economic order. The gap between the developed and the developing countries continues to widen in a system which was established at a time when most of the developing countries did not even exist as independent states and which perpetuates inequality. Now, today we know that 84% of the world's population lives in the developing world rather than 70% at the time in 1974. And they only account for about 23 to 24% of the world's income, if not less. And so, the situation in 1974 is not any better today. In fact, if at all, the gap between the rich and the poor countries, and also the gap between rich and poor within countries, has only expanded over the time. Another very important reason why the developed countries were at some sense of discomfiture during this time and when this resolution was passed was that for the first time in the context of development, the language of international cooperation as a common duty started gaining ground. So here the provision says international cooperation for development is the shared goal and common duty of all countries. Now, insofar as international cooperation was considered to be charity or generosity, even privilege, everyone was fine. But the moment the language of duty starts coming in, or international cooperation for development as a duty, the idea that there is something legally binding about this international cooperation and accountability might be fixed if international cooperation is absent or is denied, let's say through current activities we see in today's world, vaccine nationalism, right? We see that a lot, which is a clear-cut denial or a rejection of international cooperation. So the idea that international cooperation would deny us our room to maneuver, to become nationalistic when we want to, rather than looking at development as some sort of a common concern of humankind, which requires international cooperation, was not very comfortable for a lot of developed countries. Not only at the time, but even today, if we look at some of the opposition to the right to development, even today. Now, just to contextualize the mindset at the time, ensuring that one of the main aims of the reformed international monetary system shall be the promotion of the development of the developing countries and the adequate flow of real resources to them. So this explains to us the overall context from where the developing countries came in with relation to this whole idea of a new international economic order. And it was this and a series of resolutions after the 1974 declaration that led to the movement for recognition of right to development. In fact, the right to development was incubated in this environment of the movement by the developing countries towards the recognition of the call for or demand for a new international economic order. So in 1977, for the first time, the then existing UN Commission on Human Rights, which doesn't exist anymore. I mean, although you might find references to this in literature, this was replaced by the Human Rights Council in the mid 2000s, 2005, as we have it today. So the commission no more exists. Today is the Human Rights Council. But in 1977, the commission for the first time passed a resolution recognizing the right to development. But of course, at the time, these were 53 countries of the UN Commission on Human Rights, not the entire global community. So they requested the Secretary General at the time to authorize a study of the subject. Following this, a working group of government experts was created in 1981. But before this working group could conclude its work, or even rather begin its work in any substantial sense, the African bloc created a fait accompli with relation to the right to development. The African bloc was negotiating and adopting at the time its own regional human rights treaty, the Banjul Charter, or the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And Article 22 of this charter, the African countries already incorporated the right to development as a guaranteed right of all peoples and a binding obligation on all states. So the effect of this was that the rest of the world could no more ignore the topic. They had to do something about it. So in 1986, a resolution, a declaration was adopted at the UN General Assembly, a declaration on the right to development, the very important RtD, as we acronym it in our readings and as we'll acronym it throughout the course. This was adopted with an overwhelming majority of 146 countries voting in favor. We didn't have as many countries then as we have today in the United Nations. So 146 overwhelmingly voted in favor. Only 8 countries abstained, which include Denmark, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Israel, Japan, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. So the list is revealing by itself. Of course, I should point out that that some of the countries that abstained at the time, sorry for that, some of the countries that abstained at the time, such as some of the Nordic countries, have expressed more willingness today to engage with operationalizing the right to development, and explicitly even in the meetings that have been ongoing on the right to development all around. So it is likely that some other European countries in particular have joined the bandwagon of not supporting, but some others have moved towards supporting the right to development as well. So I mean, although at present there is a unified EU statement, I don't expect that to last for too long, as negotiations, for instance, on the binding treaty on the right to development progress and the implications of that are realized. Implications, I mean, only of developing countries ratifying it are realized by the developed countries. I expect there to be at some point a split among the what appears to be at this point, or at least is presented as a homogeneous European stand on it. I don't expect that to last for too long. Anyway, the opposition to the declaration was only one, which is the United States at the time. However, it is extremely important to also point out that since 1986, the right to development has been reaffirmed unanimously by all countries, including the United States, in a series of declarations and resolutions. And here I have just a snapshot of the timeline for that. Of course, we don't have time to go through each of them, but just to highlight the 1992 Rio Declaration on Development, Environment and Development, the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, the first international conference on human rights at the end of the Cold War, where you had the communist erstwhile countries and the capitalist countries coming together and declaring a common idea of human rights. So the Vienna Declaration is very important in that sense. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the United Nations Millennium Declaration of 2000, the 2007 UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. All of these unanimously reiterate the right to development. We have countries, especially in all the others, of course, in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we had 4 countries voting against, but all of them later on, endorsed the declaration. From the year 2011, also many of the important declarations and agendas of our time, including, by the way, the Paris Climate Agreement, the only treaty in this list, also recognizes and reaffirms the right to development. Of course, you have the 2030 agenda, which is the most important one in our context, as well as the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. So all of this to point out that despite the opposition to the declaration itself in 1986, unanimously in a series of declarations and agendas and even treaties thereafter, the right to development has been reaffirmed. This, however, does not mean that countries and parties do not have differences on the understandings, relative understanding of the scope of right to development, how they understand the nature, the content, the scope of the right to development, and also the mechanisms by which the right to development ought to be operationalized in practice. So while some of the countries say that, well, we are happy with the declaration and operationalization should be more programmatic, others say that we are not happy with the declaration because not much has happened. Since the time of 1986, we have only had rhetorics. What needs to be done is to convert this declaration into a legally binding instrument or a treaty. And then we should, rather than focusing only on policies or programmatic aspects, make it legally binding and a guaranteed right so that it can be enforced by whoever claims to be a victim of violations of their right to development. So all these differences exist even today. As we go through this course, we will be touching on some of those dimensions in quite some depth as well. Now, let's get a bit into the 1986 declaration and try and understand what its key features are. So I'll begin with the preambular paragraph 2 of the declaration, which describes development in the following way. Development is a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process which aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and of all individuals on the basis of their active, free, and meaningful participation in development and in the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. So you can see that it's a loaded statement. There are lots of different concepts incorporated, stuffed into this one paragraph. I've always felt that this description of development was rather ahead of its time. Because for the first time, you will see here that development is described both as a process and as an outcome. It is a comprehensive economic, social, cultural, and political process, and the outcome being aims at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population. So both the process and the outcome, focusing not only on what is achieved, but also how it is achieved. Both need to be equally compliant with the idea of development and human rights, as we will discuss. But another important thing is you will notice here that development is not measured in terms of income or wealth. It is measured in terms of the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and of all individuals. Exactly the same notion of development that emerged through the work of Amartya Sen, the economist, in 1998. It began perhaps in 1994 with the human security reports from the UNDP, which gradually evolved the idea of development as well. And of course, metamorphosed into Amartya Sen's famous book, the Development as Freedom, which won him the Nobel Prize. But this wasn't said in 1998 for the first time. Yes, from an economics perspective, perhaps, but from a human rights perspective, this declaration already said that we are committing a folly by measuring development only in economic terms. We need to measure development in terms of well-being of the entire population and of all individuals, and therefore freedoms of everyone. And that's why this was clearly, I would say, ahead of its time in a lot of ways. Not even remember the concept of sustainable development was born in 1986. Sustainable development came in 1987. Human development, the idea came in 1989 when the UNDP started producing its human development reports for the first time. Human security came in 1994. Development as freedom came in 1998. So this was way ahead of its time. It was only in the 2000s, early 2000s, that even the World Bank and the IMF started incorporating other indicators such as maternal health and education, mortality into how it measures development. This therefore was way ahead of its time in a lot of ways. Also, it talks about participatory development, active, free, and meaningful participation in development, and also in the fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. So equitable development, not development that is concentrated in the well-being of only the top or the elites at the expense of the marginalized or the vulnerable, but fair distribution of benefits resulting therefrom. Now, Article 1 is the provision which defines the right to development. And this is the most important provision, I would say, in terms of the right to development. Of course, others relating to the duties are equally important. We'll come to that. But the right to development is often confused as vague. And that's why an explanation of what the right to development is very important. It says that the right to development is an inalienable human right. So let's pause there for a moment. It is a self-standing human right by itself. Okay, there is no doubt about it that there is an explicit, emphatic acknowledgement that the right to development is a self-standing, inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to three things: participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development. Pause there for a moment. So what are the three entitlements of the right to development? The right to participate in, the right to contribute to, and the right to enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development. In other words, whenever human persons or peoples are denied the right to participate in, the right to contribute to, or the right to enjoy development, that is when a violation or a breach of the right to development takes place. What would the right to participate mean, and how could it be denied? Well, the right to free, prior, adequate consultation in development projects. That is a right of every human person. In case of indigenous peoples, the right to free, prior, informed consent, not just consultation. The ability of the right holders of development to contribute to the development policies, development plans, etc., that the government is making for that affects them is all a part of the right to development. If that is denied, then obviously that is a denial of the right to development. The right to enjoy, if you are denied the fruits of development as a result of discrimination based on ethnic grounds, marginalizations, and vulnerabilities of other kinds, discrimination based on gender, discriminations based on disabilities, any kind of activity or conduct that denies you equal enjoyment of development is a violation of the right to development. So there's nothing really vague about the right to development if you understand it, as if you delineate it into these three sub-rights: right to entitlement to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy. And then you understand it as any denial of these would amount to a denial of the right to development. Everything becomes crystal clear, to the extent that you will in fact realize that the most exercised of all rights in the world by human beings is the right to development. It is never articulated in that fashion, but take a look at any protests that go around in your communities. The people protesting against the government allowing Uber into your country, taxi drivers protesting against it, or people protesting against the government raising taxes, or the people protesting against a particular development plan, even cutting down of forests for building a highway, people protesting against it. What are they protesting against? What are they trying to hold the government accountable for? They are trying to hold the government accountable for the idea that their development priorities are not taken into account by the government. They are not reflected in the government's activities, in the government's plans and policies. Their right to participate in and contribute to development has been denied. So we see all around every single day the exercise of the right to development by people, by human persons and peoples, without ever articulating it in that fashion. Okay, so we'll see many, you can think of many examples: the Arab Spring, the protests in Brazil when the government decided to build stadiums for the Olympics without, and you know, by increasing the transportation fees, and people protested that, you know, our development priorities are not being reflected in what you consider to be important. And there are many examples: people protesting against dams. Every single example of such a kind is an exercise of the right to development by the right holders. Now, having explained that, let's take a quick look at the key features of the right to development. There are 9 of them, which I will highlight in this presentation. The first, the right to development is an inalienable self-standing human right. Development and sustainable development are thus not mere privileges enjoyed by human beings, nor are they just subjects of charity or generosity. When we say it's a human right, we mean it's an entitlement. It's an entitlement that is not of the nature of merely receiving charity or generosity. It's a right. Second, the right to development denotes the entitlement of the right holders to 3 things: to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development. I've discussed this earlier. 3, the right to development also implies the full realization of the right of peoples to self-determination, what we call as self-determined development. Peoples are the right holders of the right to self-determination, as you all know. And therefore, peoples, the flip side to this is that the right to self-determination must be realized to realize the right to development, and vice versa. Then, operationalizing the right to development involves respecting, protecting, and fulfilling all other human rights: civil, political, economic, social, and cultural, along with generating the resources of growth such as GDP, technology, etc. This means that given the very nature of development as a human right, it cannot be realized when there are violations of other human rights. In the past, there was this whole debate about whether right to development, someone proposed that the right to development should be understood as a meta right. That is the highest human right of all. That is an umbrella of all other human rights, and all other human rights are somehow they fall within this umbrella as an amalgamation of that then leads to the right to development. However, this idea of right to development being a meta right is very problematic, because then that would simply mean that in order to make a finding that the right to development is violated, you only need to point out at the violation of any other human right. So violation of any other human right would automatically lead to violation of the right to development without the need for any independent analysis. And many theorists found that this kind of meta right approach was inappropriate. However, what it clearly is acceptable and approved by almost all scholars is that the right to development and all other human rights, like any other human right, is interdependent, indivisible. They are related to each other, mutually dependent on each other. But given the very particular nature of development, which touches on many different human rights, right? The development is that the nature is such that obviously many human rights can be improved all at once through a development project, or can be adversely impacted through a development project. So given the very nature of development as a human right, it simply cannot be realized when there are violations of other human rights. In other words, what this means is that there cannot be a trade-off with other human rights. If there is a water pipeline project in a rural part of a country that the government wishes to institute and says that, okay, here we are doing it for the ensuring the right to water in the rural part of the country, which let's say is drought affected or what have you. But if the government does this laying down of the water pipeline by taking lands of poor farmers forcibly without rehabilitation or without compensation, then obviously one set of rights is being realized at the cost of another, such as right to livelihoods or right to property. You simply cannot claim here that you are advancing the right to development. Okay, the right to development cannot be advanced if there is a violation, if it is done so in a way that there are violations of other human rights. All human rights need to be taken care of if you have to claim that the right to development is being advanced. So the basic proposition here is that there can't be any trade-off between different sets of human rights. Then, the right to development requires focusing not only on outcomes which are sought to be achieved as a result of a development plan, that is the what question, but also on the process by which those outcomes are achieved, that is the how question. Both the processes and outcomes of development must be consistent with and based on all other human rights. Now, I have explained earlier that it is important in the right to development that you don't focus only on what is achieved, but also on how it is achieved. The example of the water pipeline project I gave you is clear. If you focus only on the outcomes, then you can say, yes, we have right to development through the water pipeline project. But the process by which that outcome has been reached, meaning taking away lands of poor farmers without adequate compensation or rehabilitation, is fundamentally flawed. Therefore, right to development requires focus on both the process and the outcomes. This was in 1986, by the way. In 1998, 12 years later, from the economics perspective, Amartya Sen said exactly the same thing in his book, that there is a process aspect and there is an outcome aspect to any development as freedom. Okay, but this was said way back in 1986 also, but from a human rights perspective. Another silly example that I like to give when I explain this, it's silly, but I think it drives home the point. Now think about a malnourished person on the streets. They on the streets for years together, without any means of survival and without any food source or income source, etc. Now, obviously, the right to food of that person is clearly at stake. Now, let's say the police pick up that person and throw that person into jail, where he continues to languish as an under trial, or not even as an under trial, without any charges. let's say for months together or even years together. There are documented stories of such things around the world. Yeah. So now, but in the jail, the person is actually getting good food. Okay, so can we look at the right to food being realized, the person getting good food, and say, look, the outcome has been achieved, but obviously there is something fundamentally wrong with the process by which that outcome is reached, meaning the person languishing in jail without any charges for years together, right? So what is important is not just the outcome, but the process. In the SDGs context, think of this as well. As you go along the next 3 weeks, when you analyze different SDGs and different thematic issues, think about what is it that if we focus only on the outcomes of the SDGs, forgetting the process by which those outcomes are realized, there will be something fundamentally wrong in many of those aspects. Okay, so the sixth point, human beings are individually, all human persons is the term used in the Article 1, and collectively, all peoples, the right holders of the right to development against their states as well as other states. So who's the right holder? This right is not only an individual right, it is also a collective right. So human beings individually and collectively, all peoples, are the right holders of the right to development, not only against their own states, but also against other states. Every state is entitled as an agent of all persons and peoples subject to its jurisdiction or on their behalf to demand respect for their right to development by other states and international organizations. Okay, it is extremely important to highlight here that when states exercise the right to development or claim the right to development on behalf of their people against other states, they are doing so as agents of the true right holders. The true right holders are always human beings and peoples, not states. It is always human beings and peoples that are the true right holders of the right to development. When states claim against another country the violation of right to development, their right to development, they are doing so only on behalf of the true right holders or as agents of the true right holders, which are individuals and collectives, okay, that are peoples. Also important is that states can never use the right to development against their own peoples. States can never say that, well, as a state, we have the full right to determine development priorities, and therefore our decisions are binding on you, the citizens. That can never be done. The true right holders are always human persons and peoples. This is not a state right. This is a human right. Very important to remember. Whenever this doesn't mean states can't claim that against other countries. Of course they can. They can also claim against other international organizations. Of course they can, but as agents of the right holders on behalf of the right holders. Then this paragraph, this slide is the crux of where the political debates have become so polarized on the right to development. Now, in theory, the right to development entails duties on all states to respect, protect, and fulfill the right across the following 3 levels. This is very, very clear from the 1986 declaration, but has also been reiterated constantly by what is called the high-level task force on right to development that was established in 2006, 2007. They came up with their reports in 2010 on the many different dimensions of the right to development. So there are 3 levels that are clearly acknowledged. Number 1, states acting individually as they formulate national development policies and programs affecting persons within their jurisdiction. So clearly there's an obligation on all states to frame national development policies in a way which advances the right to development of persons within their jurisdictions and does not deny it. This is like any other human right, the obligations of states internally to their own peoples. The second, states acting individually as they adopt and implement policies that affect persons not strictly within their jurisdiction. Meaning that under the Declaration on Right to Development, the obligations of states are not restricted only jurisdictionally within their own territories. It is also extra-jurisdictional, meaning that if a country's national policy is capable of violating right to development of people elsewhere, then that state is also accountable for violations of the right to development. Okay. Examples abound. I mean, you will be, if you take a look around, these examples are all around the world. You could, for instance, think of illegal subsidies granted by a country to its farmers, affecting the livelihoods of farmers in other countries which are unable to grant subsidies to their farmers. Because this country's subsidies means that though their farmers have taken over the global markets, right? And the others go out of livelihoods. We have seen, for instance, in the cotton industry, the four countries of Burkina Faso, Mali, Central African Republic, and one more, they have lost a lot of livelihood in terms of the cotton producers, many of whom committed suicide simply because EU and US decided to grant massive subsidies to their cotton producers, right? So national policies having adverse impacts. In the context of the current COVID-19 pandemic, vaccine nationalism and hoarding of vaccines in the quantity of millions of vaccines, not releasing them to the rest of the world, is a clear national policy having adverse human rights impacts on the right to development of people elsewhere. Or you could think of environmental issues, right? In the Brazilian context, for instance, which is the issue that has come out quite a lot, cutting down of the Amazons is not just a Brazilian thing. I mean, obviously, it's a national policy for, let's say, greater pasture for the cows, and but obviously the impacts of cutting down the largest carbon trap on the planet are not just locally concentrated, they are everywhere in the world. Then number three, the third level of obligation, states acting collectively in global and regional partnerships. So the obligation of states internally, obligations of states when they take national action but impacts externally, but also the obligations of states when they act together at the United Nations or at the European Union or in other global and regional partnerships, let's say the World Health Organization, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank. They have an obligation to ensure that the policies that they adopt at these international organizations do not undermine the right to development of any country or any people. In fact, they promote them. Now, where is the political split? The political split, and I would say this is the unfortunate distortion that goes on, is that developing countries say that right to development should predominantly be about points 2 and 3, because other human rights already focus on us. Okay. Whereas developed countries say that right to development is only about point 1. It shouldn't be about point 2 or point 3 at all. So when we give you development aid, it should only be about how you are utilizing our money for ensuring development projects. Are you doing that in a manner that's compatible with human rights? But it's nothing to do with what conditionalities we impose on you with relation to our development aid. Because the right to development is only about internal, it's not about the international environment. So don't blame the trade agreements, don't blame the investment regime, don't blame the all kinds of intellectual property rights regimes. Right to development is about what you countries do internally. Don't focus on points 2 and points 3, not about what we do to you. Okay. Whereas the developing countries' argument is that focus should predominantly be on points 2 and 3 and less on point 1. Well, the truth is that the entire discussions on how to operationalize the right to development and move forward has for years been stuck, politically speaking, on which of these three should be given relative weight. And the fact is that all of these are equally important. The right to development is about ensuring that all these three levels of obligations are given equal importance so that one is not denied at the other. Because if one is given more importance than the other, you either run the risk of perpetuating the existing status quo, which is giving importance only to point 1, or you run the risk of focusing only on the international dimensions and ignoring what we in general terms would call as good governance, at the need for good governance at the domestic level also. So all three are equally important in the right to development, which is why this right is the one, this feature adds such tremendous value added to the larger human rights project. This is where the right to development contributes to the larger human rights project as being the only right which gives equal attention to all these three dimensions of obligations of states. Then, the right to development imposes an obligation on states individually and collectively to eliminate existing obstacles to its realization. So if existing obstacles are there, such as, let's say, the patent regime for the vaccines that exists, and there's a demand for eliminating it because the current intellectual property rights regime is seen as an obstacle to the realization of right to development. So eliminate existing obstacles. Then refrain from making policies which are adverse to its realization. Don't create new policies which would undermine the realization of right to development, and positively create conditions favorable to its realization. Instead, create positive conditions that would help realize it. Most importantly, in all of this, in our context of the 2030 agenda, is also the fact that the right to development imposes on states a duty of international cooperation to realize the right to development. This is clear, and in the SDGs context also quite obvious, that it's impossible for any country to realize the SDGs on their own. And that's why we have the concept of means of implementation in the 2030 agenda, which I'm going to refer to briefly in the coming slides. But just to point out that unless you have the duty of international cooperation also realized, it is impossible for any country on its own to realize the 2030 agenda. All right, now with this, let me very briefly turn to the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and let's begin with with a very short statement on the Millennium Development Goals, which, as you know, were the predecessor to the SDGs. The MDGs emanated from the Millennium Declaration of 2000. The big difference being that in the Millennium Declaration, there were no MDGs, whereas in the 2030 agenda, there are the MDGs. In case of the MDGs, they were not the agreement of states at all. They were not agreed upon by countries at all, like the SDGs are. The MDGs were simply the handiwork of a group of staff members in the United Nations who decided that the Millennium Declaration would fade into oblivion if we do not operationalize that into actionable goals. And therefore came the MDGs. And there are very stories about how at the time, even the Secretary General had no idea, Kofi Annan had no idea that the MDGs were being framed, and only later learned that something like this had come about and had to ultimately endorse them. So anyway, the Millennium Declaration itself of the year 2000 said in paragraph 11, "We will spare no effort to free our fellow men, women, and children from the abject and dehumanizing conditions of extreme poverty, to which more than 1 billion of them are currently subjected. We are committed to making the right to development a reality for everyone and to freeing the entire human race from want." However, as I said, the MDGs were not drafted and designed through a participatory approach and were infused with many structural lacunae. Some of them I have referred to in chapter 3 of your required readings for the week. So I'm not going to repeat them in this, but I'll only point out that goal 8 was the global partnership for development. This was the only goal in the MDGs that was aimed at developed countries and not at developing countries. All goals 1 to 7 were aimed at developing countries, but only goal 8, global partnership for development, was aimed at developed countries. The big problem was that although there was an acknowledgement that unless goal 8 itself is realized, none of the preceding 7 goals can be realized by developing countries on their own, it was only goal 8 that did not contain any benchmarks or quantifiable targets. So while all the preceding goals, for instance, goal 1 said achieved by 2015, reduction in by half in hunger or extreme poverty. So there were benchmarks. 2015, there were quantifiable targets. Goal 8 was the one aimed at developed countries that had no benchmarks, nothing to be achieved by 2015. Okay, so they had no benchmarks at all. There were no quantifiable targets. And unless, obviously, if there were no benchmarks and goal 8 was not realized or was not to be realized by 2015, how in the world was it possible to realize any of the goals by 2015, right? So there were lots of structural problems and lacunae in the Millennium Development Goals. And a lot has been written about it, including a 2003 report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which criticized the structural lacunae in the 2030 agenda. Sorry, in the Millennium Development Goals. Now, then we come to the adoption of the SDGs. Now, part of the SDGs, a 2030 agenda, as you know, is a compilation of the 17 SDGs and 169 targets, which is a massive improvement, or let's say enlargement. Someone is writing on the slides, yeah. So please, if you could help me not do that for the time being. So there were 8 MDGs and 21 targets, and now they have expanded to 17 SDGs and 169 targets. And the reason for this expansion, obviously, was that the SDGs were drafted through a participatory approach, which included civil society, UN staff, governments, academics. And I'm sure many of those who are present in the webinar today or taking part in this course have actually had the occasion to participate in all these different thematic workshops that took place around the world, the regional workshops that took place around the world, and contribute to the design of the MDGs and targets. The only thing that the 2030 agenda did not do was it did not include the indicators. So if you look at the 2030, the SDGs framework, there are the goals, each goal has targets, and each target has indicators. These indicators are not present in the 2030 agenda. Indicators are the things that by which you measure the progress of the targets and goals. So the process for coming up with the indicators was outsourced to the UN Statistical Commission, which has come up with 230 SDG indicators. This by itself is an expansion from the 60 MDG indicators. In the final week of this course, I will share with you the upcoming thematic report, the thematic study of the expert mechanism on the right to development, which is a new body established as a subsidiary organ of the subsidiary body of the Human Rights Council. And there are 5 members on it. I'm one of them. And this report is authored by me, in which we have, as an expert mechanism, criticized the current indicators for measuring SDGs, giving a few examples of that, because the current indicators of SDGs only measure action by states internally. They don't measure action by states either externally or collectively, the other 2 dimensions of the right to development. And therefore, and it's not that there are no targets for collective goals or realization of collective duties. There are targets which aim at international cooperation. There simply are no indicators to measure that. Okay, and that's a major flaw in the current structure. But we'll come to that point in week 4 when we look at the means of implementation. Now, these are the 17 SDGs. We are not going to go through all of them. I'll just highlight goal 17, which is partnership for goals. So this is the counterpart to MDG 8. Okay, MDG 8 was about global partnership for development. Here in the SDGs, we have goal 17, partnerships for the goals, which means that unless, and there is a clear acknowledgement that unless goal 17 is realized, it is impossible for countries to realize any of the preceding 16 goals on their own. Okay, that's why partnerships are important, and that's where the duty of international cooperation inherent in right to development becomes so important. So Now, the underlying principles of the SDGs, there are two of them, which all of you should are probably aware of, but if not, you should be very aware of. The first is called the leaving no one behind principle, and the second is called the reaching the furthest behind first principle. So on the first, leaving no one behind, this is an example. By 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as less than $1.25 a day. Now, this might appear obvious to you, and nothing surprising. But in fact, it is a dramatic change from how the MDG one was framed in terms of extreme poverty. MDG one only required reduction by half, only said reduce by 2030 by half the proportion of people who are extremely poor. And that was a problem because then countries could focus on the relatively well off among the extremely poor and continue to ignore the worst off sections, which could be the minorities, which could be in rural parts, discriminated in other ways, and focus only on those in urban areas or ethnic majorities, etc., and still claim success. That was a major problem in the MDG structure. That has been removed and eliminated by the principle of leaving no one behind. So now we are covering for all people everywhere. And then the other one is the principle of equity, reaching the furthest behind the first principle. By 2030, ensure that all men and women, in particular the poor and the vulnerable, have equal rights to economic resources, etc. So you reach the ones who cannot survive another day the first, and then focus on the relatively well off in this. Now, these principles were already present in the 1986 declaration, in the right to development. Okay, the if you recall development, the description says constant improvement of the well-being of all individuals and all peoples. Okay, so everyone was covered. The same language of leaving no one behind is present even in the 1986 declaration. Now, very importantly, in the context of the 2030 agenda, are what are referred to as the means of implementation. This is going to be quite central to the entire course, and therefore I think it's important that we highlight what these means of implementation are in the very first webinar. Means of implementation have a lot to do with the idea that there are certain goals. All these goals are to be realized by countries, but we must also identify what are the means for implementation of these goals. Okay, and part of the means of implementing goals, the dominant means obviously is global partnership. So global partnership has been identified as the means by which you implement all the SDGs, all the other SDGs. So let's see, there is a whole section titled as means of implementation, and paragraph 39 is the first of it. The scale and ambition of the new agenda requires a revitalized global partnership to ensure its implementation. We fully commit to this. This partnership will work in a spirit of global solidarity, in particular solidarity with the poorest and with people in vulnerable situations. It will facilitate an intensive global engagement in support of implementation of all the goals and targets. The means of implementation targets under Goal 17 and under each SDG are key to realizing our agenda. So what the 2030 agenda does, it lists a lot of goals and targets, and then specifically identifies certain goal and targets, Goal 17, and certain targets as the means of implementation of the rest of the agenda. So where do you find these means of implementation targets? Paragraph 40 gives us an indication. You find them under Goal 17, which is the goal for global partnerships. And then you also find them under each of the SDGs. So I want to explain this a bit. In total, there are 62 means of implementation targets in the 2030 agenda. In total, there are 62 means of implementation targets. These targets are the key to realizing all the other goals and targets, meaning if you do not realize these targets, which are the means of implementing the others, it is impossible to realize any of the goals and targets in the 2030 agenda. So what are these special means of implementation targets that are the key to realizing the 2030 agenda? There are two streams to this. The first is under SDG 17. SDG 17 itself is titled Strengthen the Means of Implementation and Revitalize the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. So as you can see, the entire Goal 17 is the means of implementing all the preceding 16 goals. Unless you realize Goal 17, the entire structure collapses on its head. You can never realize any of the preceding 16 goals. It's impossible to do so. That's why Goal 17 is the means of implementing the other 16 SDGs. Under SDG 17, as you will see from the 2030 agenda, there are many different targets. There are in fact 19 targets. It's the longest of all SDGs, and they relate to all forms of international cooperation through, for instance, financing for cooperation, sustainable development, technology sharing. There's in fact a whole technology bank created under the 2030 agenda, capacity building through cooperation, and then a lot of trade and the WTO rules. In fact, it also says, by the way, that successful and early completion of the Doha Development Agenda, which has been stuck since the year 2001, as you know, at the WTO, is key to realizing the other 16 goals. Yeah, so these are all areas which require global partnership and international cooperation. And there are systemic issues that have been pointed out, also targets including policy and institutional coherence, multi-stakeholder partnerships, including the business sector even, and also the data monitoring and accountability, which is one of the main reasons for why we do not know how real is the deceleration in the 2030 agenda, or how real is the progress in it, because many countries simply lack the capacity to gather credible data. But that can't come simply on their own. It requires international cooperation to enhance facilities and trainings and capacity building, technology, finance for data monitoring and accountability. So this is one stream of the means of implementation. Goal 17 and its 19 targets by themselves, means of implementing all the preceding 16 goals. Then each of the preceding 16 goals also have two types of targets. There are the numerical targets and there are the alphabetical targets. Okay, so this is an example, SDG 1, numerical target 1.1, alphabetical target 1.A. These alphabetical targets are the means of implementing the numerical targets, and therefore the very goal. Okay, so let's take a look at SDG 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. The numerical target is by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. What is the alphabetical target? This is the means of implementing 1.1. Ensure significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources, including through enhanced development cooperation. And the rest can follow. So what is it? This 1.A is again the means of implementation, the global partnership. Unless there is enhanced development cooperation through mobilization of resources from a variety of sources for countries, it is impossible for them to realize 1.1 and therefore the very SDG 1. Now, the big question for us is, if you look at all the ABC targets together from goal 1 to 16, there are 43 in total. So 43 plus 19, you reach 62 means of implementation targets. Now, what has happened is this. If you take a look at why there is deceleration in the realization of the 2030 agenda, even prior to the pandemic, you will notice that there was a deceleration in each of the means of implementation targets. If the means of implementation targets themselves decelerated, how is it possible to realize any of the goals? And it's therefore no surprise at all that we worsened non-stop since 2015 the progress on almost every single goal, simply because the means of implementation targets themselves decelerated. There was, for instance, constant reduction in development aid and assistance in terms of financing, the most obvious one that we are talking about, right? 0.7% commitment by the OECD countries, DAC countries to that reduced. In fact, it was less than half of 0.7%. In 2019 was worse than 2018. It even reduced in 2019 more than as compared to 2018, and so on and so forth. Uh, so if there was deceleration in every means of implementation target, how is it possible to realize the other goals, right? Now, the problem obviously is that we have continued having the means of implementation or understanding the means of implementation targets that require international cooperation only through the lens of charity or generosity. Maybe even countries saying that, okay, it's the good thing to do, it's the right thing to do, but there is nothing legally binding. There is no duty involved in how states understand international cooperation through the means of implementation. That is why we reach a situation where the means of implementation decelerate and the entire agenda goes off track, simply because the right to development has not been mainstreamed, has not been internalized into the 2030 agenda. In week 4, as I said, I'll be sharing with you with our study, the expert mechanism study on it's a guidance to countries on what they need to do to operationalize the right to development and better implementing the SDGs. And a lot of it is devoted to the means of implementation, which is also the theme for your final week. So we will discuss a lot more in that week on this point. Now, let me very briefly address the symbiotic relationship between the right to development and sustainable development. And I'm going to be very brief here, just pointing out the legal instruments for your reference if you were to study this further. Way back in 1992 and 1993, through the Rio Declaration and the Vienna Declaration, countries had already accepted unanimously that the right to development should be fulfilled so as to meet equitably the developmental and environmental needs of present and future generations. Similarly, if you take a look at the 2030 agenda, paragraph 10 clearly acknowledges that it is informed by the declaration. In paragraph 11, the 2030 agenda reaffirms the right to development by reaffirming all the outcomes of the major UN summits. Specifically, they reaffirm explicitly all the principles of the Rio Declaration, which, as we have seen in the previous slide, emphatically the principle 3 was on the right to development. And in paragraph 10, also the 2030 agenda grounds itself in the Millennium Declaration, which, as we saw, one of the clear main objectives of the Millennium Declaration was making the right to development a reality for everyone. So there are textual linkages also in these instruments on right to development and sustainable development. But also from a policy perspective, there are two ways in which the symbiotic relationship between the two can be analyzed or looked at. First, the very adoption of the 2030 agenda by states could be seen as an implementation by them of the duty stipulated in the 1986 declaration to take steps individually and collectively to formulate international development policies with a view to facilitating the full realization of the right to development. So this is an obligation in the 1986 declaration, and you could take a look at the SDGs and say that, well, the SDGs are a policy expression of the intention by states individually and collectively to realize their obligations under the declaration and a plan of action. The SDGs are a plan of action for operationalizing the right to development. That's one way of analyzing the symbiotic relationship. The other way, which is where I personally am more interested in, is not stopping at merely the fact that, okay, this is the adoption of the 2030 agenda and that's enough. What I'm particularly interested in is how operationalizing the right to development can in turn significantly bolster the realization of the 2030 agenda by providing its means of implementation with a normative framework effectively stipulating that the participation in, contribution to, and enjoyment of sustainable development by all human persons and peoples ought not to be seen as charity bestowed upon them by states, but as a human right with corresponding duties. And in this sense, the right to development gives proper shape, color, and texture to the SDGs by purposely stressing on the right and duty aspects of the SDGs and delinking it with the quote unquote business as usual approach of charity and generosity. Okay, it delinks it consciously by purposely stressing on the right and duty aspects of sustainable development. Now, if you were to want certain linkages, this is a slide from a PowerPoint that has been attached to the optional readings. It's created by the OHCHR on the links between the right to development and SDGs. It kind of identifies on the left side the principles and elements of right to development, and on the right side tells you which SDGs are related to that. So this is theoretical, but if you were to be invested more into this issue, if you want to write something on it, for instance, this is a very helpful parallel between the principles and elements of right to development and the corresponding SDGs and targets. Finally, let me just very, very briefly, because we've run out of time and we have to have ample time for questions and answers, just point out some key aspects of operationalizing the right to development. What does it mean? I mean, some cross-cutting themes. As I've said, we will go through the other thematic dimensions from week 2, but some cross-cutting elements. And in our report, the first report of the expert mechanism, which I have repeated already, I'll share it with you on the in the final week. And that's, by the way, because it's not yet undergone the editorial process. It's to be submitted for consideration by the council in September session. So the editorial process is ongoing right now. Hence, I'm not sharing it today. We have insisted in that report that the human rights-based approach to development, which is the current dominant framework adopted by the United Nations system and by development agencies around the world, needs to be recalibrated. We say this because the current framework of HRBA, it's not a normative framework, by the way, it's a conceptual framework. Those of you who have been into academics know that there are theoretical frameworks, normative frameworks in law, and a conceptual framework, right? So this is HRBA is a conceptual framework. The only aim of HRBA is to ensure that when development projects are undertaken or planned or designed, they are done so in a manner that links the objectives of the project to one or the other human rights and then advances those human rights. So water pipeline project, if you adopt an HRBA approach to it, it would mean that the norms and standards and principles of human rights are mainstreamed, that development projects should be undertaken in a way where no human rights are harmed, and it is attached with the right to water and other human rights, and you can clearly see its advancement. Now, nothing problematic in this in that sense. The only problem and the major problem with HRBA is that it focuses almost in practice, yeah, not in theory, in practice, almost exclusively on what the recipients of development cooperation are doing. So let's say the World Bank funds a water pipeline project or a dam project in a particular country. Then what HRBA looks at is only what the recipient country is going to be doing with the money received as it goes ahead implementing the development plan. So don't violate rights of indigenous peoples. If that's around the dam, don't harm the environment. All of these very essential. But who is going to look at the conditionalities of the World Bank in that loan? Right? So HRBA doesn't focus on that in practice. When development agencies give loan to a particular country for construction of a road, Who's going to look at the obligations of the donor country? HRBA limits itself to in practice, by the way, I keep on insisting in practice, only on what the recipients of cooperation are doing with the cooperation received. And even among the United Nations, UN staff, I mean, when I interact and work with a lot of colleagues on the field, I come from UN academia, but those in the field, when we interact and when we look at HRBA, no one's introspecting on what our obligations are as development cooperation providers. You're looking at mostly HRBA from the lens of what the recipients of cooperation are doing when they receive cooperation and implement it on the ground. So that is why we have called for recalibrating HRBA and focusing on all three dimensions of cooperation, of right to development, not just internal, but also external and collective. These three levels, internal, external, and collective, are equally important. Similarly, with relation to, I mean, I should just point out, by the way, that there is this new thing called development-based approach to human rights, which is promoted by some countries where they say that, well, why should we call it human rights-based approach to development? In fact, development should be a prerequisite for human rights. And this is also fundamentally flawed approach, because what this presents is it understands development only as economic growth and says that unless you have economic growth, you cannot have human rights. So in the meantime, human rights can be violated till we reach economic growth. Okay, that is also equally flawed. Right to development is, it doesn't make either human rights or development preconditions for each other. It doesn't make them preconditions for each other. It insists that development itself is a human right. They are not two separate objectives, such as one is dependent on the other. Development itself is a human right. Very important. And then another example is recalibrating human rights impact assessments. So, you know, when we look at the World Bank, IMF, WTO, there are no processes for impact assessment of, there are no systems in place for conducting impact assessments of their policies or their laws. It's only about impacts of the recipients. That's where we need to also recalibrate human rights impact assessments to incorporate not only the internal dimensions of assessing human rights impacts, but also the external and the collective. Now, finally, to conclude, the heightened importance of COVID-19, I'm going to run through some very important statistics which indicate the heightened importance of the right to development. As of 22 June 2021, over 182 million people had been infected with the pandemic, and over 3.9 million have died. 88 million, 215 million more people have been forced into extreme poverty globally just since the pandemic began. These are not collective. These are not the total numbers. These are just the people who are now more forced into extreme poverty just since the pandemic. In 2020 alone, between 83 and 132 million people were added to the almost 690 million people in the world considered undernourished in 2019. As of February 2021, 272 million people are estimated to be acutely food insecure due to COVID-19. This, as we know, is the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, but obviously the most adverse impacts are on the global South, much more than the global North. It's not that the global North is not facing economic crisis, but if you look at the proportionalities, the global South is facing a lot more of it. 90 of the 122 low and middle income developing countries have entered into economic recession. Equivalent of 255 million full-time jobs have been wiped out globally just in 2020. In 2020 and 2021 alone, repayments on public external debt for developing countries overall are estimated at nearly $3.4 trillion, including between 666 billion for middle income countries, and for low income countries, it's even worse. It's $1.06 trillion. That's staggering in terms of the public external debt. Even before the pandemic, debt accumulation had outpaced income growth in many developing, least developed, landlocked, developing, and small island developing states. At the beginning of the pandemic, 44% of the LDCs, this is the beginning of the pandemic, yeah, so end of 2019, 44% of LDCs and other low-income developing countries were at high risk or in debt distress, and the figure is certain to rise as a result of the pandemic. Importantly, this number of 44% is a doubling of debt risk from 22% in just 2015. And that's what I mean, we decelerated massively. In 2015, when the 2030 agenda was adopted, the debt risk was only for 22% of LDCs. In under 5 years, that doubled to 44%. How are we going to realize the 2030 agenda? Many, and this is also very important, many low-income countries spend more on debt repayments than they do on their entire national health budgets. Think of the implications for this during the COVID-19 pandemic. When countries need to increase their spending on health, they are busy repaying more amounts for their public debt expenditure. And this is why so many calls for relief in terms of debt have been ongoing, but all of them have gone unheeded, as we see. And we'll have a wonderful webinar, a panel style webinar in week 4 to discuss all these issues. ODA disbursements in 2019 were at 0.3% of the combined GNI of OECD DAC countries, which was even lower than in 2019 and less than half of the committed levels of 0.7% under target 17.2. Now, this is also a very important figure. Prior to the pandemic, the annual unmet SDG financial needs already amounted to $2.5 trillion, combined with a further reduction of 700 billion estimated in 2020, and the increased need of financing due to the pandemic of 1 trillion, the total SDG financing gap in developing countries for 2020 is estimated to have increased by 70%. That is $4.2 trillion. This is just in the developing countries, the financial gap in 2020, $4.2 trillion. Okay, now, of course, these are the financing is the means, one of the major means for realizing the SDGs. Now, the final remarks, just 3 of them I want to point out. One is from the UN Special Rapporteur on Right to Development, Saad Al-Farargi. I am deeply concerned that decision makers will step away from their promises to reduce inequalities between and within countries during the current fight against the coronavirus pandemic by adopting policies which may reinforce and exacerbate vulnerabilities that already exist. The second is from Obiora Okafor, the independent expert on international solidarity. Without realizing the right to development much more fully, especially in the global south, an accomplishment that would be impossible in the absence of greatly enhanced international solidarity, the global human rights situation after this pandemic would not become any better than it is today. And the final quote is from the first thematic study of the expert mechanism. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed existing fault lines in global solidarity and international cooperation and has accelerated the derailment of the 2030 agenda. There has never been a more urgent need for operationalizing the right to development to mobilize the means of implementation through fulfillment by states of their duty to cooperate. So I will stop there with my presentation. Thank you all for bearing with me for a few minutes more with the presentation. I'm happy to take questions. We can take them for about 30 minutes or so. I have a few questions. I'll take them alternatively from the mic and from the chat box. So let's get the mic first. Is from Farzad from Iran. Please go ahead.
Hello, sir. Thank you for your great presentation. I really enjoyed it and really loved that. You are one of the few people that is talking about the global partnership regarding the right development. Mostly other experts are prioritizing the internal development over the global partnership, which is wrong. My question is about the draft of legally binding document of the right development, which is under process by the different countries. As you clearly mentioned that developed countries are trying to dodge a global partnership, and this is one of the discouraging aspects that they are pursuing in different forums, in different HRC, General Assemblies, and different resolutions. They are even, for example, Finland in 2014 conference on funding for the development in the states that, for example, the good governance is prerequisite to the allocation of the fund for development of the country. So it is a prerequisite for development. So how do you see that these prioritization, prioritizing the Convention of the Civil and Political Rights, would affect the joining of the EU, for example, a convention on the right to development? And further, you mentioned that the development approach to human rights is flawed. But as far as I know, that the basis for this approach is the 1968 document, which was, if I'm not mistaken, the proclamation of Tehran. So, in which that the states clearly recognize that the economic development is a prerequisite to the civil and political development. So, I was wondering that what was the balance between these two approaches? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for those questions. I did not hear the second question very clearly. So maybe if you can type into the chat box your second question, that will be great. The first one, I gathered it. There was the voice wasn't very clear all the time, but I'll answer the first one. Yes, you're right that as in the current negotiations that have been ongoing on the legally binding instrument on the right to development, United States is not participating at all, and so it's not even present in the negotiations. And this was announced by them a couple of years ago that they wouldn't be engaging with the negotiations on the legally binding instrument. The European Union has opposed the legally binding instrument itself. The idea, their stated stand is that there are other ways of operationalizing the right to development, and we don't accept that a legally binding instrument is the right thing to do at this point. But the EU is engaging in the negotiations, not paragraph by paragraph as yet, but at least it's present throughout the negotiations. It's observing, it's taking note, which by itself is, I think, an area of optimism. It's an area for everyone to be optimistic. The parallel that can be seen is from the parallel ongoing negotiations on the legally binding instrument on business and human rights. Those of you who have been following that issue, there is a treaty being negotiated right now also on business and human rights. And similarly, there the EU had initially said that they won't be participating. They had in fact walked out. And then they started realizing the implications of what would it mean if this treaty is only ratified by developing countries. And the implications are massive. If, let's say, the Business and Human Rights Treaty is ratified only by developing countries, as was the intention, that's where the whole push is coming from, the foreign investors of the developed countries operating in developing countries would still be bound by it, simply because the host country has ratified the convention, right? So the moment you realize these things, they decided that they want to participate in the negotiations, and they are now actively participating in the negotiations on the Business and Human Rights Treaty. My sense is that exactly the same thing is likely to happen also with the Right to Development Treaty. Once over a couple of years, now this was we only had an initial first round of explanation of the provisions last month, or earlier this month, in fact, at the Human Rights Council, at the working group on right to development. And I see already 4 or 5 names actually in those who have joined us today. We're also participating there in those debates as well. That was only the first reading, but the next reading is going to be in November this year, later this year. And from there on, I expect that a lot of this realization would start seeping in, that if we are not parties to this convention, it is in fact more counterproductive to us than being a party to the convention. Okay, so because foreign investors will get impacted, the countries, the engagement in international organizations will get affected only if developing countries ratify this treaty. So it is bound to be, because one of the principles, of course, is if I have as a country undertaken human rights obligations, if I am bound by a treaty provision, can you, as another country who's not a party to that treaty, do anything that forces me to violate my international law obligations? The answer is you can't. International Law Commission clearly stipulates that no non-party to a treaty can force another state, which is a party to a treaty, to violate its own international legal obligations under that treaty. You can't reach such a situation which requires another country to violate its international law obligations. This is recognized in international law. So think about countries that are not parties to the Right to Development Convention, that decide not to be parties to it. What would it mean for their ability to require another country to violate their right to development obligations? They would be in violation according to international law, right? So once all of these realizations start seeping in, as I said at the outset, my expectation is that what now appears to be a common European stand is not going to be a common European stand. There are already indications that countries would, within the EU, would take different stands over time on this aspect. Especially the Nordic countries. In our meetings, it's quite clear that some of them do support the legally binding instrument. Perhaps, who knows? I mean, it's Spain, Portugal might support the treaty as compared to the rest. So we'll see what happens, but that would be my answer to your question. Yeah. You still have another one?
Yeah, no, it is in following of that question. One of the debates in during the draft, the draft debate is that having a legally binding document would maybe some country would maybe define it as a joining it as a recognition of some rights and not joining it as not recognizing the right to development. There is a debate and there is a concern in that regard. For example, Russia and Iran, our country, expressed this notion that for recognizing the right to development is already recognized, and joining the convention shall not be interpreted as recognizing the right to development or not recognizing the right to development. How do you answer these interpretations?
Yeah, again, I mean, I'm not very sure I understood the question correctly, but I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Let's say some countries oppose the economic, social, cultural rights and say that if we accept the right to development, we would be accepting that also, and that's a problem. Is that the question?
No, some countries are interpreting the legally binding document as a recognition, a base for recognition of the right to development, and by not joining it, they would interpret that it is their right to not recognize the right to development. Some countries like Iran and Russia debating these concerns and say that it should not be interpreted that, and the right to development is already recognized internationally.
Okay, I understood. Yeah.
So
yeah,
how do you?
Yeah. I got it. So I think, I mean, there are many different ways of analyzing that. I don't think the fact that not ratifying a treaty means that you don't recognize those rights. It simply means that you don't submit yourself to the international legal obligation and to international scrutiny. Just because, for instance, US has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child doesn't mean that they doesn't believe in the rights of the child. I don't think that proposition is accurate in international law. However, there are also other features. I mean, when these negotiations are taking place, countries make their written statements. They make their written observations, and EU, for instance, clearly says that it believes in the right to development in their written statements. It just doesn't believe that a legally binding instrument is the right way of going forward. Okay, so these statements are part of the record, and they can be cited as evidence. But I think, it's the concern hasn't been raised to me, because I mean I chair the drafting committee of for the treaty. But if it has raised, there is a very simple solution to that. You can simply introduce a provision in the treaty itself, which stipulates that not non-ratification of this treaty would not signify opposition to the right to development. I mean, something like that. But again, I mean, I don't think that is really as as solid an argument. Non-ratification simply would not mean that you don't agree. To the contrary, countries like Mexico also have said in their written statements that we do believe, we do agree in the right to development, but we are not yet clear, we are not yet sure whether the right to development would be the legally binding instrument would be the right way of going forward on this or not. Countries take time. There are many different domestic pressures, domestic political environments that delay the ratification by countries of many treaties. This doesn't mean that they don't accept the right. Another way of arguing it is that because of overwhelming consensus among states on the right to development, as reflected in these resolutions and declarations, it already exists in customary international law and is hence binding on countries already. So the fact that you don't ratify a treaty doesn't mean that you don't recognize the right at all. Yeah, so there are many different ways in which you can counter that argument. I personally simply don't feel that it's a strong argument at all, that because you don't ratify the immediate, you should leap to a conclusion that therefore you don't recognize the right. I don't think that would be a valid argument at all. I have, let's say, I'm going to take one from the chat box and then revert back to the. So Alisar says, how does the international community reconcile the rejection of scope of jurisdiction 2 and 3 with the Paris Declaration and Accra Agenda for Action in International Cooperation? How does it do so? Well, through distortions. Through being selective in different fora, by creating fragmentation of international law or fragmentation of these instruments. At the WTO, you take a particular stand. At the Human Rights Council, the same country adopts a different stand. You do this by fragmenting these things. So obviously, in the Paris Agreement and the Accra Agenda, it is, or the Addis Ababa Agenda even, it's clearly acknowledged that international cooperation is key for all these, aspects, financing for sustainable development, trade, etc., etc. When you come to the Human Rights Council, the same countries say that no, we don't accept that points 2 and 3 should be given adequate weight. It should be all about point 1. We just completed a reading of the expert mechanism study. It was in the formal meeting of the expert mechanism, which took place a few days ago. And one of the opponents of the right to development argued that the report gives unnecessary weight to international dimensions. It doesn't focus on the national dimensions. It focuses on international dimensions, whereas it should be focusing only on internal dimensions. And so you see these exist. And what can explain the divergence of opinions in different fora, except for the fact that states tend to be selective, and fragmentation of these institutions and their mandates tends to create the enabling environment for countries to be selective before different forums. It's a constant in international relations. Okay, let's take Eric's hand. Eric, go ahead first.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question. The right to development and the sustainable development, they both refer to development. They want to know, what does a development mean? What does development mean? Because it seems to me that development may mean different things for somebody living in a forest in DRC and for somebody living in Paris or New York. It may also mean something different for somebody living in the Sahara Desert. So
You are
I want
absolutely right.
to explain a bit what the development
You
means.
are you are absolutely right. And it is for this reason that development is not defined in either the 1986 declaration or in the draft convention. Development is described but not defined. Described as we saw in the preamble, development is a comprehensive economic, social, cultural process aimed at the constant improvement of the well-being of the entire population and of all individuals, etc., etc. So it's described in this way, but it's not defined because, principally because the original authors of what development means to them are the right holders of the right to development. When we say self-determined development, it essentially means that development, what development means to particular peoples or to human persons, is to be determined by them and not by the state, not by the international community, not by a treaty, not by a declaration. The right holders, if you don't, because simply take it this way, that if you do incorporate a definition of development and impose it on people as a one size fits all definition, it would obviously not fit within the cosmovisions or the development understandings of some, but essentially from the very outset, it would deny them the right to participate in and contribute to development, which is key to the right to development. What does right to participate in mean? It means that people determine their development priorities. They determine what development means to them. They determine how the design should be and what they want to do with it. So this very fundamental right would be denied if we adopt a one size fits all idea or definition of development. It's for this reason that very wisely the drafters of the 1986 declaration did not define it. They left it to the right holders to do it. And so also the draft legally binding instrument makes it a point to insist that it doesn't define development. It describes it but leaves it to the right holders. Of course, this is not the same to say that there is no definition of right to development. There is a definition of right to development in Article 1 that is very clear. That's not the same as saying that there is a definition of development. So development is not defined because you can't impose a one size fits all template, but right to development, meaning entitlement to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy self-determined development, is part and parcel of the treaty and the declaration. Okay, so let's take a question from the chat box. Kathy, how will states, especially in the developing countries, willing operationalize the right to development as individual states, knowing that they rely on aid from the more Western countries? Linked to this is also the fact that most of the developing countries are already facing additional burdens that affect the right to development, such as conflict, famine, floods, political issues, which have also been worsened by the ongoing global COVID pandemic. Thank you so much. Oh, all right. So there are a variety of ways of looking at this question. It all boils down to the to the point about let's say what happens if only developing countries ratify the treaty and developed don't, or what happens if even in the absence of the treaty only developing countries want to operationalize the right to development. I think the first point here is that the right to development, like any other human right, needs to be seen as a project. As a project, I mean something that is not going to happen overnight. It's a constant struggle to make it operationalize. And so you can think of how long it took the rights of persons with disabilities, or rights of women, or rights of the child to actually get into legally binding instruments, or to even operationalize on the ground. So I think in that sense, it is not surprising that there is so much opposition to the right to development from the global elites in this case, right? As in other cases, it's from the other local elites. In this case, it's from the global elites. There are practical ways of doing it. One is for the United Nations system itself to internalize the right to development. And I think that's a low-hanging fruit. It's a low-hanging fruit because what this would require is merely recalibration of human rights-based approach to development, which is the dominant framework. And it would require recalibration of human rights impact assessments, which is also a dominant framework in current UN practice. Once the UN does it, it's an easier argument then to say that the specialized agencies should also do it. And there is a legally binding obligation on the specialized agencies to do it. Who are the specialized agencies? Yeah, the World Health Organization, etc., but also, by the way, the World Bank and the IMF. The WTO is not a specialized agency of the UN. It's an independent organization. But the World Bank and the IMF have an agreement of agency with the United Nations. They are specialized agencies. And there's a very solid argument to make that if the UN is under an obligation to promote human rights and the right to development, then the specialized agencies also have it. The agents can't do anything that defeats the principal's objectives, right? Or the obligations. So there are ways in which you can try and infuse or make changes in the global order. The problem at this time is that there is unwillingness across the board and a slight reluctance also from within the organization to getting this done, to recalibrating it in this fashion. I see positive changes, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, when now all of a sudden the entire UN system, right from the SDGs level to the bottom level, everyone's talking about shared responsibility and global cooperation. All of a sudden now, because of the pandemic, it's realized that we are one, and it is impossible for anyone to survive on their own. So I think there is a massive opportunity for the COVID-19 pandemic to be used as an opportunity for change. Like in many societies there is a phrase where that every crisis is an opportunity. So the COVID-19 pandemic clearly needs to be seen as such, as an opportunity, and that's the reason why we are insisting on all of these things about mainstreaming the right to development in realizing the SDGs. There are practical things that can be done about this, which we have indicated in the expert mechanism study, such as measuring the right to development, measuring the progress on the SDGs through a right to development lens, focusing both on 2 and 3 as well, not just on 1. This shouldn't take much. It's the UN Statistical Commission which needs to come up with revised indicators. No one said it thus far. The expert mechanism now will say it, so maybe that will be enough reason or mandate for them to do it. But that can be done. It's not a difficult thing to do. When the high-level political forum does its revisions and reviews of the sustainable development goals and progress on it, it can focus on the means of implementation and the right to development. When countries produce their voluntary reviews, they can focus not just on obstacles they face internally, but also obstacles they face in realizing their SDGs emanating from the international environment. What is missing at this point is any sort of knowledge on what these external objections, obstacles are for countries. Countries produce year after year their annual reports on SDGs, but what are they focusing on? Only on internal obstacles, not on the external obstacles. And that's why in the expert mechanism study, we are insisting that when countries submit their voluntary reviews, they make it a point to not only highlight the internal obstacles they face in realizing their SDG commitments, but also obstacles they face from the external dimension. So that also is important. So there are ways in which this can be done. And I would say the report of the expert mechanism goes into quite some depth on these aspects. Okay, I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So Shruti, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor. It was an amazing presentation. So I had a quick question regarding driving this towards the actual realization of RTD, as also we had seen in the Intergovernmental Working Group discussions and debates, and also when I was personally talking with few of the ambassadors present in the discussions, they mentioned, and they even used the word, that there is a loss of appetite in their domestic foreign affairs decisions, and also in global affairs, where even the developing states feel the loss of appetite for RTD to become a legally binding document, or to even focus on operationalizing RtD, whereas the current global affairs has seen huge importance given to issues such as climate change, and issues such as um, um, sexual orientation and gender orientation. And how do we have to approach this when there's no spotlight for the issue of poverty, or for the issue of the 84 percentage of the population of the world? So how do we bring the spotlight, or how do we see that we bring back the appetite as it was in the decade of development or so? And also, as you mentioned about the business treaty on business and human rights, and how it is attracting and pressuring the developed states to also take a strong stance, and you expect the same to happen with RtD. How do you see business and human rights can go complementarily with RtD? Do you think both the treaties can be mutually complementary? So it creates a pressure to be an effective part of both.
Hmm. Yeah, those are very important and interesting questions. I should acknowledge the work that's done by the other special rapporteurs and independent experts on, extreme poverty and foreign debt and all of those. They have been doing some phenomenal job in putting the spotlight on all the issues that you talked about. Now, specifically with relation to right to development, there is in fact a tremendous surge and in movement that I see, especially after the adoption of the 2030 agenda in 2015. If you take a look at what happened since 2010 to 2015, or in fact 2005 to 2015, not much on the right to development. It's only after the adoption of the 2030 agenda that all the four major steps that have been taken on the right to development to take it forward have gained that momentum. So for the first time, a special rapporteur on the right to development was appointed. There was an independent expert until 2005, but nothing from 2005 to 2015. For the first time, a special rapporteur was appointed. Then the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution for elaboration of a legally binding instrument on the right to development for the first time by the working group. For the first time, they also set up and established an expert mechanism on the right to development. And for the first time, they also decided to establish a biennial panel on the high-level panel on the right to development. So all this has happened in the last 4 years. Okay, so there is a tremendous surge that I see like never before in terms of right to development. The problem, of course, in terms of the negotiations on the treaty has been the COVID-19 pandemic. So a lot of countries' loss of appetite has been simply because they haven't received any information from the headquarters for negotiating. I mean, as you know, some of the major countries like India, for instance, did not actively contribute to the negotiations. This is not because they didn't want to. This is simply because they did not receive instructions from the headquarters and because of the pandemic. And this is the situation with most African countries who did not receive responses. I mean, we are working with some of the African countries as part of the expert mechanism. So not with my hat as the chair of the drafting group for the treaty, but the other hat as the expert mechanism. And we know that many of the African countries who have interacted with us have told us that the pandemic just took over and they did not have any time to analyze the provisions of the treaty and send their written or participate actively, which they will do in November. Okay, so I think there is an increased appetite. The pandemic did not help, of course. It diverted all the attention from the direction right to development was moving in. But gradually, I think it will all come back, because I mean, if there is anything that's clear through this pandemic, it is that unless the right to development is operationalized, you can't take into account the course correction is impossible. On the Treaty of Business and Human Rights, I also see a comment here from Melissa in the chat box, so I'll take those together. She says, in fact, the binding treaty on business and human rights is led by Latin American and African countries. The response of Europe and several of its countries is to make their own laws, and they are in that process. Yes, I mean, so it's true that the whole treaty, it's the Ecuador process as it's called, but also countries like South Africa and Eswatini and many others have pushed for the Business and Human Rights Treaty. It's also a fact that the European Union was not a part of the negotiations in the beginning, but they are now participating in the discussions. The revised draft will be out or is out already, and the European Union participated in the last one. They will participate again in the next round of discussions of the working group on business and human rights. But it's at the same time also true that it is up in the air whether European Union or the countries of EU will ratify the eventual treaty, because as Melissa points out, they have also decided to go their own way, which is the European Parliament recently adopted a directive calling upon the European Commission, which is the executive wing, to come up with a law mandating mandatory due diligence for business corporations, not just in EU, but that deal with EU companies as well, so across the supply chain. It's a wonderful step. Only time will tell whether the executive wing has the political appetite to accept what the European Parliament has said in the directive. It's not necessary that they would go exactly identical to that. But there are good movements in that. Many European countries have also adopted or gone closer to the realization of obligations of home states with relation to their corporations operating elsewhere, creating jurisdictions in domestic courts for victims of corporate abuse elsewhere. So there is progress in the European Union in that sense. Only time will tell, as I said, if they will ratify the treaty eventually when that happens or not. But in terms of parallels, I think there could have been more scope for parallels had the Business and Human Rights Treaty not bypassed a very key issue, which is obligations of business corporations to respect human rights directly under international law. The Business and Human Rights Treaty very early on the negotiators decided that this is a tricky issue. It has been tricky for years now, since John Ruggie's UN Guiding Principles, which said that businesses only have a moral responsibility under international law, not a legally binding duty to respect human rights. So negotiators decided that they would avoid that question altogether and adopt a victim-centric approach, meaning an approach to the treaty that focuses almost exclusively on remedies. That if there are violations of rights of victims or abuses, so corporate abuses, what remedies will they have? So they have adopted more a remedy-centric, victim-centric approach and completely bypass the normative dimensions of what obligations who has and whether businesses themselves have an obligation under international law. In the last draft, there was an obscure statement in the preamble which just said businesses have a responsibility, not a duty, but a responsibility in the sense of corporate social responsibility, the idea of volunteerism, to respect human rights, but not a legally binding duty. In the draft treaty, however, on the right to development, we've gone on to say that everyone has the minimum duty to respect human rights. Businesses, individuals, corporations, international organizations, no one is at liberty to harm the human rights of others. Okay, we haven't specifically listed businesses, but we are focusing a lot on the principles in the draft treaty on right to development, as other human rights treaties. We're not bypassing or ignoring those aspects. And then, of course, there is the operational dimension through the mechanisms, treaty bodies that are created. So there are parallels that could be drawn even now, but could have been much better. That would be the answer. Okay, I think we can come to an end of this presentation. We have gone on for more than 2 hours. Thank you all for joining. I know there are some questions that are unanswered, but we can always use the discussion forums to look at those. Okay, so please feel free to use the open forum or the discussion forum to post your questions and engage in a discussion with each other. And also myself and my co-teacher, co-instructor, Obi, we will be responding also to your discussions. Thank you all, and see you all next week.
Thank you.